A.J. Muste was one of the most profound religious personalities I've ever known. But he was not a sectarian religious individual. He believed in Christianity as being the religion of love.
He really loathed that notion of hypocrisy, of not practicing what you preach. So if he was going to preach the word of Jesus, then he had to try to practice it to the extent that he could as a human being. And that meant, among other things, that he would not fight, that Jesus was very clear on that.
He very much was somebody who believed that you can't have a social movement unless you have ideals, that you believe that it's possible to transform the world. And moreover, that those ideals had to be realized in action and experience.
His commitments and actions were not born of naivete, but out of deep conviction and deep, well thought out positions.
He insisted that the only way out is to find our moral center and stay with it and advocate for it and organize with it.
He made the connection and connected the dots, so to speak, with economic injustice, racial injustice, and war.
There was that of a prophet in A.J. when you heard him speak with his long, bony finger making his point. He was both speaking the truth and also demanding the impossible.
Prophet, labor and political organizer, anti-war activist, disciple of the peacemaker, and one of the leading forces of the 20th century, Abraham Johannes, A.J. Muste, was born in January of 1885 in Zierikzee, in the Netherlands province of Zeeland.
It was a region of the Netherlands that, through consolidation of commercial agriculture and so forth, had a large number of sort of dispossessed peasants, essentially. So Muste's parents were, like many, rather impoverished, and his mother had some brothers who had gone to Grand Rapids and had found some economic opportunity there, and they were invited by the brothers. I think they paid their passage. Muste by then was, I think, around 6 years old. They traveled in steerage. They went through Castle Garden, which was where people went, as opposed to Ellis Island, and they settled in Grand Rapids. And Muste was the eldest. There had been a son who was born before him, who was also Abraham Johannes, but he had died, and so Muste was given the same name. And so it was a very tight-knit community.
The Dutch communities were quite insular. The Dutch immigrants were considered the bottom of the cultural groupings. They were mostly employed by other people to do menial work. They were very ambitious and worked hard, and for the most part were very dependable.
The family was distinctly a working class. The father was an unskilled factory worker in the city's furniture industry, and they lived right across the street from the furniture factory where they worked, in a neighborhood that was mostly Dutch. Muste started working in this factory himself during the summer times when he was 11. Their church was a Calvinist church, and so even as they were really welcomed as, white immigrants, they also had a certain distance from American culture. They thought it was too materialistic, too optimistic, too Methodist, as it were. And so they really maintained their own separate religious and cultural institutions.
The church reinforced this cultural solidarity. The minister was conceived to be the domini, which means Lord. And in many instances, the domini was the best educated person in the congregation. So he was consulted for advice about many things. Domini, should I take this job? Should I go for this job? Should I marry this person or not marry this person? And the domini would sometimes tell them no or yes. So he was a person of power within that congregation.
And Muste really thrived in that atmosphere. He, he loved the church. He felt destined for the ministry.
And I think, there are things about that culture that never left A.J., even though his thinking obviously evolved beyond the sort of strict limits of that. But I think there are things about that Calvinist approach to the world that stuck with him and that in a way informed what he was able to do later. Because while that sort of strictness is what gets all the press, there's also a deep commitment to understanding that philosophy and to personal introspection that's part of that. And I think that was there for A.J. just as much as the perceived rigidity. The other thing that I think helped A.J. move beyond that, and this is in his writings as well, was his discovery of the documents of the founding of the United States and the values that are contained in there. And he was really struck by that. The idea that all men are created equal and so forth really aligned with his religious thinking, but also brought it into the political sphere.
I always felt that understanding and having a feel for his religious faith and his religious center was central to understanding everything else about him. And he wasn't just religious by doctrine, that changed over time, but he had a kind of mystical sense of the divine as he perceived it, and that mystical divine broke into his life several times and was responsible for some of the changes that he went through. So he became a member of the Dutch Reformed Church very much younger than was normal. I think he was 13 years old when he asked to become a member, and he went through a rather stern process, it seems, of being questioned and so forth, and was then inducted into the church. And he always assumed, and his family assumed, as a male in the family, that he would become a Dutch Reformed minister.
So as the eldest son, the family did what they could to ensure that he had those opportunities.
By all accounts, he was a student of exceptional promise. At 13, he began attending Hope Preparatory School in Holland, a gateway to Hope College. One of his jobs in high school was working in the library there. He took the opportunity to read everything he could get his hands on, especially science.
And he had access to books on evolution. And one of his friends from Fourth Reformed Church, who was studying for the ministry, told him he'd get in a lot of trouble by reading those books on evolution. But he went on and read them anyway. And probably the seeds of taking away that sense of literal belief in the scriptures began to be planted then when he started reading those books on evolution. Sneaky guy, reading the books on evolution.
Once in college, he eagerly sought out modern scholarship.
I know that he was very excited when the school finally opened a department of physics and chemistry and a department of biology. He was very taken by the new professor of biology, very influenced by him. He was, as Muste said, a scientist in the modern sense of the term. He was allowed to perform dissections rather than just, read about them. And Muste found all of this very stimulating. Well, he was very successful at Hope College. He was the star. He became valedictorian, to no one's surprise. He was the editor of the school newspaper. He was sort of a reformer in a sense. Hope College was fairly conservative. Mainline Protestantism had really embraced sort of this muscular Christianity where you were supposed to be out in the world and seeking out action and being, physically fit for Christ. Hope College was a little apprehensive about such things, but Muste really pushed. He was a leader in the movement to get intercollegiate athletics at Hope College, and was the star of the basketball team. He was captain of the Flying Dutchman, and they won 2 state championships with him as captain. So he really thrived at Hope, and I think it really provided this really safe, nurturing environment, where he could sort of practice his skills at oratory, while at the same time he chafed against its limitations. And so by the time he graduated from Hope, he is very much ready to be out in the wider world. He still feels himself destined for the ministry. He identifies as a good Calvinist, member of the Reformed Church, but he's clearly impatient. He wants a life of action, of experience. As he said, and I'm paraphrasing, he saw that his future was in the English-speaking part of the United States. And so that's one of the reasons why he goes to New Brunswick Theological Seminary.
Before he headed to the New Brunswick Seminary, he took a year to teach Greek and English at the Northwestern Classical Academy in Orange City, Iowa, another Dutch Reformed community. Why so far away? During his time at Hope College, he formed a bond with a young lady.
He did meet his future wife, Anna Huizinga, and she was quite a catch for him, because one of the things, again, to remember is that Muste really did have this working class background. His back home in Grand Rapids, his father continued to work in that furniture factory until he was in his 80s. And his siblings were generally expected to sort of follow the same path. Anna's father was a Reformed minister in Iowa, and very well educated, very, literate. And so after graduation, Muste went to stay with the family in Iowa for a year. It was really a chance to sort of solidify his commitment to Anna. Back in those days, as Muste recalled, you were engaged, but you certainly could not get married until you had finished seminary and you had a paid-for job, because otherwise you were looked upon as someone who lacked self-control. That's what he said. So I think that's sort of funny. But he really enjoyed being with her family. They spent the year or two that he was there, I think just a year, reading books and talking about them, and just a kind of a lively intellectual atmosphere in rural Iowa. And so he was really disappointed when he went to New Brunswick Theological Seminary, because it wasn't like that. It was a pretty mediocre institution at the time. It was very, very conservative theologically. What I argue is that was certainly a source of dissatisfaction for Muste, because he was interested in what was going on, and it was sort of an exciting time for new trends in theology and philosophy and so forth. But it was also, I think, that that it was sort of insipid, and the faculty were selected only because they had a good go at being a minister, right? So they weren't trained academically, and so it didn't have that sort of rigor. Now, having said that, they loved Muste just like they did at Hope College, and they similarly, when he became, I think he was valedictorian again, and they wanted him to teach at New Brunswick, So on the one hand, he was very critical of it, but on the other hand, I think it also was a safe place for him. And one reason actually that he was so loved there is that, he was obviously very good at school and got good grades, but he was one of the only students, because this is back east, who could actually speak and write in Dutch. And so as they're, doing their, I guess, ministerial practicums, he would be sent out to the Dutch-speaking churches, and he could give a sermon in Dutch and so forth. And so that was something that was considered pretty important and special to them.
In the process, he began to really question some of the doctrine and some of the interpretive, scriptural interpretations that the Dutch Reform tradition provided. And he was doing that because he began to get involved when he moved east. He began to get involved in some of the social justice movements that were occurring, the social gospel movement.
So New Brunswick, he felt, was mediocre, but there was some sort of an exchange program. And so he was able to take classes at New York University and at Columbia University. And this was really, really exciting for him because Columbia University at that time in particular, they had just hired John Dewey, the great pragmatist and philosopher. And so he took classes with John Dewey and others who really opened his mind. And he recalled in particular attending a lecture by the great William James. And at the time, he was taken with James's book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. You know, it defined religion really broadly and inclusively, right, in sort of relativistic terms. And this was, you know, pretty radical stuff for someone like Muste, who had been raised in this Calvinist church. James also very much talked about mysticism and spiritual inwardness and experiences as paths to God, you know, and truth. And again, that clashed with what Muste had, you know, been taught, where, you know, it's about doctrine and about the church and so forth. And so all of this sort of subtly shifts his worldview. Another influence, though it doesn't come out until later, but I think it's absolutely critical for understanding Muste, is pragmatism. The idea that truth is found in experience, that you know something is true, perhaps even religious belief, if through your experience it turns out to be true. And so that always gave Muste this orientation toward experimentation, toward community. You know, the truth of something was to be found through that interaction with others, through your experience. And then you might revise your idea.
Between his next to his last year in seminary, he went to I think it's called Middle Collegiate Church in New York City. And there he said he worked in what would be called the slums. And he went to minister to people where he said the smells were awful and the sounds were raucous.
Well, he loved it. He said, and again, I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, there's some people who can't stand New York. I always loved New York. He loved being around immigrants, around the hustle and bustle of the city, found it quite compelling. So he gives a valedictory address where he condemns the school for its low academic standards. And that's really his real beef with New Brunswick, that it's time to adopt more modern academic standards. He's offered the choice between two pastorates. I can't remember exactly the details about the ones he didn't take, but my understanding is they were outside of New York City, whereas the one, Fort Washington Collegiate Church, was a Reformed church in northern Manhattan. There were very important sort of leading figures in the city there, middle class, educated types. Raymond Fosdick was a parishioner there. And so he chose it for the challenge it presented, he said. But before he could, you know, take up his pastorate, he had to be ordained. And he had to go get Anna. And so he, first he goes back to Grand Rapids, and there's this very solemn ceremony. He has, where the members of his sort of home church to sort of test him to see if he's ready. And then he marries Anne. He returns to the city and goes through the same process with the classis, or the presbytery of New York. And then he takes up his pastorate.
One of the reasons he liked being there was because it was near the Yankee Stadium. He was a great baseball fan. One of the reasons why I like him, because I'm a baseball fan too.
He loved baseball, and he actually loved popular culture. And in some ways, that's something I think that distinguishes him from some of the other pacifists and sort of liberal Protestants and leftists in general, right, who sometimes are disdainful of popular culture. He loved the Marx Brothers. He loved baseball. He could spend all day at the ballpark.
And it was near Union Seminary. Union Seminary had a much broader outlook theologically than New Brunswick did.
So while he's doing a great job as minister, he also is taking classes at Union Theological Seminary, which was really the center of liberal Protestantism.
He was being exposed to some of the progressive kind of critical analysis of Christianity and tying Christianity to doing practical things in the world for the poor and the downtrodden and so on.
You know, took classes on the social gospel, learned about biblical criticism, the historical Jesus.
He said that the professors at Union Seminary just opened up his mind and gave him new insights of what God was doing and what the scriptures meant.
So as he did that, he began to move away from his Dutch Reform position.
He felt that he lived in two different worlds, right? One was this very exciting academic kind of liberal theological world of Union Theological Seminary, where he had these faculty mentors who were sort of the leading modernist thinkers in Protestantism. He became friends with Norman Thomas there and others who would become really important in socialism.
He turned away from the literal interpretation of the scriptures. He became liberal as far as the scriptures were concerned, and this gave him a sense of God's love for all people, not just those who were predestined to be loved by God. So he had a much broader theological outlook as well.
So he finally has a crisis of faith, to realize that he could not ascribe to the doctrines of the church, like original sin and predestination and so forth. So he had this pretty profound crisis, and even left the city, they said, for nervous prostration, with his wife, obviously to rest and recuperate. He felt that he wasn't sure if he could go on living. But then he had this tremendous mystical experience where he felt as though God spoke to him and said to him that, he loved him, and that the real meaning of Christianity was to follow Jesus, to try to follow his example and to try to Christianize the social order. And so he comes back really refreshed. And all of this is reported even in the New York Times. I mean, it's a pretty big deal. So he came back and he reported his doubts to the classis, the sort of central body, and resigned, right? There's some funny quote from one of the members of the Reformed Church. He says, "I blame Union Theological Seminary for the whole thing," Others, like Henry Sloane Coffin, who was also part of the Presbytery, said, "Why do you need to leave? None of us really believe, as young folks, we don't really believe in, all the doctrines of the church either. So why don't you reform it from within?" And Muste could never compromise his conscience. If he had decided that, this was the Christian thing to do, then, he had to follow it with his whole being. And so that's why he left the church. After leaving Fort Washington Collegiate Church, he went to a Congregational church in Newton, Massachusetts. The Congregational church was somewhat similar to the Presbyterian and the Reformed church, but it had long ago left Calvinism. Again, it was one of these churches with a pretty impressive parishioners, faculty from local preparatory schools and colleges and, middle-class professionals. And he very much was welcomed into this community. He was invited to join a discussion club. So the company he was keeping were people like the Reverend J. Edgar Park, who was the future president of Wheaton College. There was Willard Sperry, who was the dean of Harvard Theological Seminary. Then, of course, Bliss Perry, who was a specialist in the Transcendentalists, who would later become editor of the Atlantic Monthly. So all of these folks were just terribly important to Muste in bringing him closer to that transcendentalist sort of spirit that he had imbibed as a young man. And so he felt very close and part of this American tradition of nonconformity. He felt himself part of Thoreau's sort of America, as it were. And he would say that the very sight of Boston Common, would make his sort of heart beat or whatever. So he's really brought in. He had first-rate organizational skills. He was just really, really good at keeping track of records, following through, doing all those sorts of detailed work that really can make an institution or an organization flourish, along with having, obviously, something compelling about his personality, his sermonizing, and so forth, that really brought people together. And so again, he meets success at the Congregational Church, and they really adore him.
And this brings us up to the World War I era. And as he prepared his sermons and looked out on the world as a young Congregationalist minister, he began to have serious doubts about the moral rightness of World War I.
Most Americans didn't want to get involved in the European Great War. And I mean, even President Wilson didn't want to get involved in it. And so Muste and members of his discussion club, Bliss Perry and so forth, they joined this Christian pacifist group.
The Fellowship of Reconciliation was founded in 1914 in southern Germany. There was a conference of clergy and laity. War was imminent, and this gathering from all over Europe had hoped to prevent the outbreak of war. Unfortunately, before their conference had ended, war had broken out. And as the group were departing, two of the participants stood together on the train platform. Henry Hodgkin, who was a British Quaker and philosophy professor in England, and Friedrich Sigmund Schulze, who was the German chaplain to the Kaiser, stood together and looked at each other and embraced, is the story, and said, though our countries are at war, we can never be at war with one another because we are one in Christ. And so they pledged to each other that they would go back to their countries and they would commit to pacifism and commit to relationship with each other despite anything that their nations might be doing against each other. And Hodgkin did that immediately, founding the first national branch of the Fellowship of Reconciliation in Britain. Schulze went back to Germany, began to offer his views and beliefs to the Kaiser, and was relieved of his position. In fact, my understanding is he was imprisoned, and when he was released in 1917, he started the German branch of FOR. But in 1915, Hodgkin traveled to the United States, gathered a group of 68 pacifists in New York, and founded the U.S. branch of the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I'm not sure if A.J. Muste was part of that 68. I don't think he was. I think he joined the fellowship later.
Some records are missing, but both A.J. and Anna Muste show up on the 1918 list, along with others of his discussion group. The U.S. chapter had grown from 76 in 1915 to about 1,100, and they came from all over the country.
Members pledged themselves to follow Jesus, and that would include, not participating in war.
When I went up to the church in Newton, Massachusetts, where he was preacher in World War I, and I read the correspondence there, it took him a while. He didn't just immediately say, oh, this is terrible. He went back and forth in his thinking. So he wasn't somebody who just jumped from one thing to the next. He worked it through and kind of rode two horses at once in a while, until he got stable to where he thought he was. And when he began to express those doubts from the pulpit, and then when young men from his congregation began to die in the war, tension obviously occurred. It was to be expected.
Members of his discussion club, some of them renounce their pacifism. Others say, I can be a personal pacifist, but I'm not going to offend my congregation by, speaking out against the war. And Muste, again, couldn't compromise his conscience. And he said that he didn't know how he could counsel his parishioners who had sons in the service when he didn't support the war. You know, would he have their confidence? And the congregation, again, you know, sort of begs him to stay, to rethink his position. Finally, though, he says that he simply can't preach in favor of the war. And, you know, there's been a lot written about the wartime hysteria around World War I and how it led to tremendous repression of conscientious objectors, to members of the Socialist Party who stood against the war. And so Muste really becomes sort of persona non grata.
And he ended up leaving that post. And at that point, he was married by now. He had one child with, I believe, another one on the way, and they needed a home, and he needed a spiritual home. And he had made, as he was working with all of these other groups that he'd come to know, he'd made connections with the Society of Friends and had become involved with them. And so he was invited to Providence, Rhode Island, to the Quaker meeting there. And even though that meeting didn't have pastors or preachers the way traditional denominations in Christianity do, he was enrolled as a minister to work with that congregation in that meeting. And so he finished out the war years there, working on behalf of conscientious objectors who were being very brutally treated in that war.
So, you know, he almost gets arrested there for treason because of his anti-war views. So, so what happens is he very much realizes that he is fundamentally a Christian and a Christian pacifist. The repression of pacifism really came as a surprise to a lot of people to the few people who stayed true to their pacifism when the war came. We're talking about people like John Haynes Holmes, the great Unitarian minister and pacifist, John Nevin Sayer, whose brother was an advisor to the president. He was a pacifist, an Episcopal priest. And so this really was shocking to them how they were being repressed and hounded. And that's why Muste and these others become founding members of what becomes the American Civil Liberties Union. As John Haynes Holmes recalled, there suddenly came to be this, I'm paraphrasing, this discourse of civil liberties that hadn't existed before. And so Muste is very involved in that, protecting the rights of conscientious objectors, protecting the rights of the international workers of the world and socialists to speak out against the war.
At the same time, he was getting involved with the labor movement.
So the gender politics of Muste's decision-making, you know, have to be interrogated, right? Because Anna Muste was ultimately fine with the switch from the Reformed Church to the Congregational Church. I mean, in some ways, you know, it's a very similar sort of pastorate, relatively well-paid, middle-class sort of lifestyle. But his decision to take a stand against the war, lose his pastorate, and become sort of this persecuted radical with no money, you know, came as quite a shock for her. So that was pretty difficult. But one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that Muste was a fairly charismatic personality, and so he had a couple of wealthy pacifists, followers of William James, as it turns out, who became very interested in his cause and really believed in him. They thought he was a saint-like figure who should be supported. And so they helped to pay for him and another minister to stay in the Back Bay in an apartment as they sort of found the way, as they tried to follow the meaning of what was the meaning of following Christ in the context of what was by now, you know, 1918, 1919, a massive Red Scare, government repression, a very active and dynamic labor movement, a Bolshevik revolution. I mean, it was really quite dramatic times. And so what did it mean to be a follower of Jesus in this moment? And so they formed themselves into a group called the Comradeship. Their benefactors would worry a bit about Anna, right? And made sure that she and I think her son was born at this point, were okay. And the ministers would wake at 5 o'clock every morning to study biblical passages, to kind of figure out what they were going to do. And they finally decided that they would form a sort of preaching order and go out and support striking workers in any way that they could. And as it turned out, there was a massive textile strike going on in Lawrence, Massachusetts. This is 1919. There's been a lot of scholarly attention to the big strike in 1912, but this one was just as dramatic, involving 30,000 textile workers, 12 different nationalities, 12 different languages out on strike in Lawrence, and it was a pretty intense affair. So the ministers go in, and at first they set about, in kind of typical pacifist fashion, to kind of investigate, interview mill owners as well as workers. And they finally come to see that the workers are absolutely justified, and that the creators of violence in Lawrence are the capitalists, not the workers. And so they volunteer to help out with the strikers, and soon enough Muste is elected head of the strike committee.
And the workers asked them to stay and help them carry out this strike, because it was getting very dangerous. The management was threatening violence. There were provocateurs in the ranks of the workers. It wasn't a guaranteed victory at all.
The strike went on for a long time. At times it was bloody. One of the stories about that I find really interesting is Muste recalled this in one of his autobiographical sketches, that he said back in the jungle days, of the labor movement, it used to be that leaders of the strike would avoid the picket line because they would be picked off by the police. But he and another one of the ministers, in consultation with the other leaders of the strike, they said, I think it would help morale, because it seemed like the strike was getting nowhere, if we go on the picket line. So they go on the picket line, they're picked out, they're beaten pretty badly, taken in a police wagon, go to jail. They're worried about what's going to happen to them that night, because it could be quite dangerous. As you're taken from the local jail to the bigger jail, bad things often would happen. They end up getting released because bail is posted, and they go right back to the picket line, and that proved to be a tremendous morale booster.
It was a day-to-day, don't think we're going to be able to make it through kind of situation. And there were some very dramatic moments. The Italian anarchist Carlo Tresca came in one day and made a dramatic appearance and fled immediately. There were times when the apartment where Muste and his friends were staying was invaded. Fortunately, they weren't there at the time, or they would have been badly beaten.
So one of the most provocative things they do is they mount machine guns at the strikers. And sure enough, some of the strikers say, let's turn them on them, like turn around and mow them down with the same machine guns. And Muste manages to convince them to stay nonviolent. Now, he came to find out later that the person saying, let's turn the machine guns on the strikers, was a spy. And that is something that, a lesson he never forgot. And what he said is that you can always tell a spy that they always are the most militant, right? The most aggressive, the most hardcore. And so he was always suspicious when someone was like that.
The way this all comes to a head finally is quite dramatic, and shows how sometimes the most unexpected development is what comes to your aid. One of the stockholders in the textile mills, a lady by the name of Elizabeth Glendower Evans, was not happy with what the mills were doing, and she decided to intervene. And she came to the town one day and decided, as Muste later described it, to take a walk. And as she walked through the town, this is a 63-year-old lady just strolling down the streets of Lawrence, the picketers who had been told they could not picket anymore all came out behind her. And according to Muste, by the time she had completed her walk, there were thousands of strikers all surrounding the mills. And this was a sign to the mill owners. We've got one of our biggest stockholders here. We've got 1,000 people looking at us.
But it seemed that no matter their morale, no matter their solidarity, that it just wasn't going to happen. And so they began to prepare for defeat. They had made an alliance of sorts with the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, led by the great Sidney Hillman. So the idea was that Muste was going to leave town while they announced that they were giving up the strike. He was going to go to a meeting with the ACW, I think. As he's sort of walking despondently to the train station, suddenly he's approached by a representative from the American Woolen Company, I believe. And he goes, and the head of the woolen company starts cursing him and saying, what are you doing? And finally Muste says, is this what you brought me here for? And the guy says, how do we settle this goddamn strike?
And so Muste said it came at a time when they thought they didn't have one day longer, that they were going to have to capitulate.
And so they are victorious. And this is an incredibly exciting moment. I mean, their union is recognized, they get their demands met, there's no discrimination against strikers, and so they're able to go back to work.
And this is the first time that you see AJ figuring out how to apply what he was learning about nonviolence to a practical situation. And because of the advice he gave, do not respond to the provocateurs, do not engage in violence, because he was able to persuade the workers in that direction, they actually won the strike. And he was, that gave him suddenly kind of a reputation as a wise, effective organizer, which is not something he'd been planning to become. He was just a minister trying to do the social gospel. But he was now getting involved in a whole new world, quite apart from any kind of traditional religion.
And he fully embraced the workers' cause. We need to find out all we can about this industry, because soon we're taking it over for ourselves. He really became a revolutionary. But also, so he had these deep revolutionary ideals, but he also had this pragmatic orientation where he wanted to see what worked, what didn't work, and adjust accordingly. And so he proved enormously effective.
A nice dramatic story with a nonviolent theme that came out well. And that had to have buoyed A.J. Muste's sense of how these things can be done, and given him encouragement to, if we pulled that off, what else can we do? So he soon became involved with the Textile Workers of America, a new union. He helped to really get it off the ground.
They managed to I think, get up to 50,000 members. I mean, there's strikes all over the place in the textile mills. But there's also the Red Scare, and that employers are really able to use to their advantage. The other thing that helps the employers is that there's an economic recession. And so they're able to kind of get the momentum back in their favor, and they basically, ultimately, after a year or two, begin to, break their contracts, fire strike leaders, undermine their union agreement, and they do so violently. And then meanwhile, the left is sort of adopting a very insurrectionary politics. They have some of the anarchists are in their union, and there's some sense that they may be involved in some of the bombings that are going on. The Communist Party, some of whom are involved as well, go underground. So things are pretty out of control by the end of 1921.
And this was a very critical, volatile time.
And he was very close to the Amalgamated clothing workers and to the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which had found a lot of success in building union culture, right? Through education classes, through leisure activities together, through drama, through sports, through all sorts of activities that brought workers together as unionists, you know? And so he was very influenced by that. And so he sort of begins experimenting with these ideas that you might call workers' education even as head of the ATWA. But the labor movement really is in crisis and collapsing by 1921, and the writing's on the wall as far as Muste can see. And so he really becomes committed to this idea of workers' education. And this idea was shared by progressive unionists throughout the United States. Muste turned to workers' education in part because he thought it might help workers to build up their own union culture, to build upon working class knowledge and use it for workers themselves. And so he was very influenced by the needle trades, by the clothing workers who had already initiated workers' education programs. Now, historians of workers' education have often emphasized the sort of middle class, university-based faculty who were interested in this, like M. Carey Thomas of Bryn Mawr College and the great Charles Beard, the historian. But the initiative also came from the workers themselves. And so Muste had supporters like James Maurer of the Pennsylvania Federation of Labor, John Brophy of the mine workers, very close to him. He was a huge supporter of workers' education. Fania Cohn of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. I mean, there was deep and widespread support among progressive unionists. Progressive unionism didn't die in 1921, 1922, or 1924 with the defeat of the Farmer Labor Party, but it was still a force. They just recognized that historical circumstances had to change. Basically, what they were trying to do is modernize the labor movement, right? They see that there are industrial workers. They see that the AFL is really ultimately only interested in organizing skilled workers. They see that women working is something that's not going to go away. So how do you organize a woman worker? They're very interested in these questions, and they think that the best way to accomplish this is to develop a new attitude and a new spirit, a spirit of inquiry, of education, but education for action, right? And so workers' education just becomes a really important project of progressive unionists in the 1920s, and Muste is really at the center of it all.
And so the textile workers kind of went by the by, but he was invited to become the head of Brookwood Labor College in Katona, New York.
We often think of Brookwood Labor College as just sort of a labor college that was right there, right outside of New York City. And they would have these unionists come, they would take classes, they would have scholarships from their unions. But it's important to recognize that its curriculum and pedagogy was really spread throughout the entire union movement. There's not just the AFL, right? There's city labor councils, there's state federations, there were other labor colleges, and they were all part of this pretty tight network. And so it was a pretty exciting time, I think, for them, even as they knew they were sort of, the minority within the labor movement.
And this was a perfect thing for the family because at last he had a position, they had a home. One theme that runs through Muste's life is the toll that his work and his being willing to take risks always took on his family, and particularly on his wife Anna. But for a little while anyway, they were stabilized here. This college had been going. He came in and changed it quite a bit. It was for labor organizers. Unions would send their organizers to the college. It was run very much on a communal basis. The students did the janitorial work and they did the cooking and they all worked together. And at the same time, they were involved in trying to take unionism to a new place. The American Federation of Labor was the the main union. It was an old-fashioned craft union, not reaching the masses of workers who really needed the support and organizing that they weren't getting.
The wonderful thing about Brookwood and progressive unionism was that it was ecumenical, right? They tried as hard as they could to be very inclusive. At certain points that became impossible, often not because of them, but because of others.
But under Muste's leadership, they tried, making sure the college studied organizing women and people of color. He also saw to it that the college addressed the issue of race prejudice. Those weren't the only departures from the established union practices.
Brookwood and workers' education comes to represent sort of progressive unionism more broadly, and really becomes sort of a center of friendly criticism of the AFL. At least that's the way they thought about it. And the AFL, over the course of the 1920s, becomes increasingly conservative. Brookwood faculty and progressive unionists wanted to develop a culture within the AFL where you could freely criticize policy while also being considered a loyal trade unionist. And that simply was not okay, particularly to Matthew Wool and others in the AFL who felt very threatened by this new unionism, this desire to organize industrial workers, this desire to be political, this desire to be idealistic. They found that very threatening. And so the AFL very much red-baited Brookwood and Muste in 1928.
Well, Brookwood Labor College was partly supported by the AFL. So the tension there between what they were expected to do and what they were really going to do got worse and worse. So while Muste was the dean of Brookwood Labor College and teaching traditional classes and so on, he was also very much involved with something called the Conference for Progressive Labor Action.
And this was a very dynamic organization, and basically it consisted of progressive unionists, militant members of the Socialist Party also were part of it. They made it their goal not to support dual unionism, but rather to help to build and expand the AFL and unionism in general by not being intimidated by the AFL bureaucracy.
And it was a much more radical approach to dealing with the issues of labor than the AFL was willing to even countenance.
With the founding of the CPLA, they increasingly are in action. And this is when they go to the Great Textile Revolt in the Piedmont and are involved in the strike in Marion, North Carolina, for example, which ultimately turned violent. 6 strikers were shot in the back and died. A dozen others were injured. Which happened down in Dixie on the borders. And Muste was there. Was in Marion, North Carolina, in a little mountain town.
There were other local preachers leading worship at the funeral service, but the sermon fell to A.J.
It wasn't that Muste was estranged from the church at this point, but he certainly was very distant from his role as a minister, but he stepped forward and delivered a sermon. These men are good soldiers who have fallen in a war that is as old as humanity. They are martyrs in the noblest cause in all the world. The cause for which they died is the cause of labor, the cause of justice and freedom for the plain people who do the work of the world and who bear its burdens. He went on to suggest that, like these martyrs, Jesus Christ had chosen to side with the common people, which is why the elite of his time called him a revolutionist and crucified him. And then later at the gravesite, Muste stepped forward and said, "We consecrate this worker's body to the earth from which it came. He has fought a good fight in a noble cause. He will rest in peace." So I think that really is evocative of the ways in which Muste was totally committed to the labor movement as sort of the movement that would really create a more peaceful and just world. And so they're really starting to assume sort of a central role in trying to organize the unorganized.
And this then sets up a good bit of conflict between the powers that be, the status quo of the labor community, and the insurgent radicals who are trying to get their foot in the door.
And if you study American radical history in the 1930s, then A.J. Muste comes up immediately as a key figure, along with a handful of others.
Muste's sympathies were all with the insurgents.
Well, I think the only way to understand what happens in the early 1930s is the context of the Great Depression. And the fact of the matter was that there was tremendous unrest. I mean, there were unemployed who were marching in the streets. There were bread lines. There was a real sense that this was the moment of crisis for capitalism, and in a sense, the moment for socialists like Muste.
He didn't think you could ever have economic justice with capitalism.
The AFL goes after Muste very much so, and they tell their affiliated unions to disaffiliate from Brookwood, to not send any more students. And it's really a shame and on so many levels, because Muste was right in the process of turning Brookwood into a university and ultimately had to remain a college. But, you know, he still had support in certain unions, the more progressive unions, and so they still sent their students. They sort of ignored the AFL. They still sponsored scholarships. Things became tight, of course, with the Great Depression, but he had a base of support. And so Brookwood continued, and then continued to move into the field, because with the Great Depression, it just seemed like, you know, obviously it was a time for action. And workers were revolting, so the point was to go there. And then one of the ironic aspects of this that Muste never got over was that he was actually very tight with some unions that were AFL unions, including the United Textile Workers. And so the United Textile Workers were very supportive of their work in the Piedmont, for example, but then the AFL wouldn't come through with funding, or, you know, so yeah, they were pretty disappointed in the AFL over and over again.
Not everybody in Brookwood was convinced that A.J. was going the right direction.
That was because Muste began to talk and write about the need to go beyond the CPLA to create a new political party.
I'm sure where he was dealing with communists and all kinds of other people in the labor movement who wanted to use violence against the capitalist pigs, you know, who were engaging in killing, shooting the strikers, putting them in prison, beating them up, all of these things. And you have to face these philosophic questions and deal with them intellectually. And at some point, you weaken for a while.
A.J. is known throughout most of his life for being a very even person, able to solve conflicts, able to bring everybody together around difficult issues, but he hadn't quite reached his full capacity for doing that at Brookwood. And I think this is the one time in his whole career where he didn't behave as generously, as compassionately, as lovingly as he always was known for doing. So he said some mean things to those who were saying mean things to him.
And yes, he said something very insulting to one of his dearest colleagues of many years, you know, those who can do, those who can't teach. I think he insulted her.
And Brookwood came unraveled, and the Mustes were forced out.
This is in 1933.
So, you know, one of the things in the writings that struck me was his sense about how he handled the end of his term at Brookwood and the way that he did that, and being, in retrospect, expressing a certain amount of remorse and shame about that. And I thought, okay, that's really good. That's really important that he does that he's able to do that publicly and say, I was wrong in how I handled this. And when he hurt other people, I think he felt it deeply. I think it filled him with remorse, and I think he worked really hard to avoid it.
He was out at Brookwood, but he still led the Conference for Progressive Labor Action.
Now, the CPLA had a particular philosophy. On the one hand, they were committed Marxists. On the other hand, the way that they had read Marx was that human activity mattered. And so they believed that the best way to organize workers, the best way to organize the unemployed, was not to give them some sort of ideology and tell them that this is the truth, but rather that if you organize around their concerns, that and then help them achieve concrete gains, and they see the value of collective action, they see the results of their activities, that this would build class consciousness and unionism. Muste also increasingly hoped and believed it would create revolutionaries.
A.J. was single-minded in his determination to see a revolution in our world by nonviolent means. I'm for that also, but I think there was a basic radicalism to A.J. which was marvelous.
The CPLA would soon give way to Muste's more radical organization, the American Workers' Party.
So one of Muste's messages when he was involved in labor education and his other labor activities as part of the Conference for Progressive Labor Action was that whatever you do as an organizer or somebody who's interested in the labor movement, he said, don't get the Messiah complex. Don't think you're going to do something for the labor movement and do something to them or sort of lead them. Instead, let them lead you and be of service. But I think that certainly the people who loved Muste, who had followed him into the CPLA, who found his leadership of Brookwood Labor College to be brilliant and really community building, who found his sort of non-doctrinaire approach really compelling, were very dismayed by his decision first to form the American Workers' Party. They said there's a lot of left-wing parties. Once you decide you have your own political party, then it means me as a member of the Socialist Party, for example, can't be a part of it, right? You're becoming exclusive. And the fact that he kept pushing people who supported him into a more and more narrow position, people came to believe that he had developed a Messiah complex, that he thought that he knew better than everybody else. And I think that there is evidence that that is true, that he was determined to do it despite his commitment to internal democracy, despite all of the language of the CPLA. He pushed things through and really, in a sense, behaved in undemocratic ways. So yes, I think he did sort of develop a Messiah complex. Like he knew what was right, even though the workers he was organizing didn't want to do this, even though his closest comrades didn't really want to do this. So I think that is true. He found the American Workers' Party to kind of give his labor actionists more of a sort of distinct political message and organization. But they were very much considered non-sectarian. They hated sectarianism. They refused to get involved in sort of doctrinal debates with the communists or the socialists, all of whom began to feel very threatened by them because they did have a working class base. And then they also had been very successful in organizing the unemployed leagues. I mean, they were literally tens of thousands, if not 100,000 members of the Musteite unemployed leagues. And the philosophy that they used to organize them was very similar. Organize around their concrete concerns, help them get onto relief, give them this practical experience, and that it would build a certain consciousness. So as they sort of become more of a force to be reckoned with, as Muste really emerges as a leader of a Marxist, of the American Workers' Party, certain groups like the Communist Party, denounce him, and, predictably. But also there's splinter groups with the Communist Party, like the Trotskyists. And so the Trotskyist Communist League of America becomes very interested in taking over the Musteites.
The Musteites were a real force at that time, competing with the communists and with the other groups.
In 1933 and 1934, they had some of their biggest successes. They were involved in the Toledo Autolite strike, which kind of becomes the start of the unionization of the auto industry. Muste is there in Toledo, so is his right-hand man, Louis Boudin's. They also are managing to attract some of the most innovative American intellectuals, left-wing intellectuals. V.F. Calverton is a Musteite. Sidney Hook becomes a Musteite. All of these folks who are really interested in Americanizing Marxism by fusing it with pragmatism, they're committed to Muste.
The commitment of these young social leaders notwithstanding, there were forces at work that even Muste couldn't counter.
A.J. was making contact with the Trotskyites in the United States.
The fact of the matter is that the rank and file of the Musteite movement was against merging with the Trotskyists.
Just anathema to the more traditional status quo labor organizers.
And they put it off for as long as possible. Why Muste leads the American Workers' Party, which he had done so much to build, into a merger with the Communist League of America, this Trotskyist group. Most of his rank and file are against it. They think that the Trotskyists are too doctrinaire, that they are too obsessed with the Soviet Union, you know, et cetera, is that Muste realizes that in some ways his theory was right. As you organize workers, as they gain experience in mass action and so forth, they were building class consciousness, but they weren't becoming revolutionaries. Instead, they were becoming kind of social democrats. And now Roosevelt became president, and it was pretty clear, I think, to him that workers were going to move into the Democratic Party and become, I mean, some of them already had, but become a real power base, that Roosevelt would support these unions. And so he's sort of fearful of social democracy, I think. And he's such a revolutionary, right? He says he hates social democracy. And so part of it is sort of a desperate attempt to sort of, I think, keep his hopes alive for revolution. And then, so he does affect this merger with the Communist League of America, which is headed by James Cannon and Max Shachtman, who are very much obsessed with theory, very much interested in fights with the Communist Party, and Muste loses much of his AWP members in the process of merging, and then as the year that they are merged together, the rest of them leave as well. He was defeated, you know, he lost in that battle. And so because he lost and he was following party discipline, he went and took out a membership in the Socialist Party, but he felt broken in body and spirit. He felt that the way that Cannon and Shachtman had won that fight had been through deceit, through a violation of something Muste called working class ethics. And so he was really despairing. And I think he also had come to the realization that this great movement he had built had now fallen apart, and largely through his own actions.
The people who were still close to them were really concerned because A.J.'s behavior was uncharacteristic. They really thought he was going around the bend and might really be in a serious psychological state. So they raised money to send the whole Muste family on a vacation, or at least him and Anna. I think the kids stayed home, but he and Anna went to Europe. And part of it, he was willing to go partly because he was going to get to meet Trotsky, and that was going to be the highlight of the trip. And they did meet Trotsky. It wasn't the highlight. He found, as he talked with Trotsky, that Trotsky and he did not share the same moral center, and they did not share the same overall goal of creating a society where expediency and backstabbing and all of that would no longer be necessary.
Muste sees preparations for war all around him, and he kind of clears his head. I mean, it's really years of nonstop activity.
I suppose when he went over to Scandinavia and actually met Trotsky and had a chance to talk with Trotsky and listen to Trotsky expound his position and what Trotsky wanted to do with the enemy, that might have been pretty thought-provoking. So I can see how A.J. could recoil from the absolute communist position.
They stopped for a while in France and in Paris, and he went one day when he was just sightseeing into this little Catholic church, Saint Sulpice. And as he was sitting there just looking around and looking at the architecture and so forth, he had one of these, it can be called nothing else but a mystical experience. He'd had one earlier when he left to become a Congregationalist. He'd had one when he first asked to become a member of the church at age 13, and here was another. And it wasn't hearing voices, no angels appeared, any of that. It was just this inner sense. And he said a voice spoke to him that said, "This is where you belong, in the church, not out of the church." And he was shaken to his core by that. He went back to his hotel, shared it with Anna, and began to write this long letter to one of his dear friends from Brookwood, Kara Cook, telling her what had happened and sorting out everything that he now knew he needed to do, and what was right and what was wrong, and what you could do and what you couldn't do, and why he needed to get back into the stream he had been in before, which was that of really social Christian pacifism.
And for him, Christianity and pacifism always went together. And so for him to return to the church meant he was also returning to pacifism.
The sense that I took from it was, again, not that the heavens opened up and that there was a divine revelation, but that he understood that in a way that was deeply personal, and that then did not allow a Marxist approach to things because it was outside of that, and that his own commitment to those ideas was deeper and stronger, and that was really what was at his heart in terms of his conscience.
I think he'd had to make some very, very profound analyses, political analyses and spiritual analyses, about where the human species had to go. And he had decided that it had to go in the direction of love and nonviolence. And he believed that as deeply as any person I met. Perhaps in retrospect more deeply than anybody I've ever met, because he's been through these various arenas of struggle and battle and challenge that had forced him to face all of the questions and make all of the decisions.
He did change from time to time, and he always remained a radical in his vision. I think in some ways too radical.
You know, if you were to look at a timeline of events, it would be, I don't know if it would be mystifying, but it would look like it was a crooked path. But I think that's reality. And I think people who don't allow themselves the crooked path cut themselves off from life. And A.J. was not interested in doing that. He was interested in being real in whatever moment he found himself, and into pursuing what he believed as fully as he could. And as his beliefs evolved, his values did not. That true north for him of, again, based in Jesus' teachings of what the world ought to be like, that's what drove him all throughout his career, whether he was working as a labor organizer, whether he was working as a Trotskyite, whether he was working in the civil rights movement or fighting the Vietnam War, or being denounced as America's #1 pacifist by Time magazine during World War II. You know, that stuff didn't matter. You know, I think the particulars of that journey for him were just that. They were the particulars, but they were not the journey. The journey was about continuing to be what he felt he should be as a person. And that example, that's a hard thing to live up to.